Michael Hartley was the brilliant Australian doctor with a picture-perfect life, and Layla Al-Fayed was the glamorous Dubai heiress who stepped into his world like fire to gasoline. Together, their secret affair would unravel into one of the most shocking and brutal murders the country had ever seen. The Crime Scene presents a new page of crime, a new mystery, a new shock case. Dr. Michael Hartley had everything most people only dreamed of. In Perth, he was known as one of the city's top cardiologists, the kind of doctor who showed up in glossy medical journals and was asked to speak at conferences. He drove the kind of car that turned heads at stoplights, lived in a glass-fronted house that overlooked the Swan River, and wore tailored suits that fit like armor. His wife, Claire, was polished and elegant, the perfect partner for social dinners and charity galas. Their 2 kids went to private schools, their photos smiled from the Christmas cards mailed out every December, and their family vacations looked like advertisements for happiness. But beneath all the expensive polish, Michael was restless. He thrived on control, and control came easily in the operating theater. When a heart was failing, he stepped in like a god, fixing the muscle with calm precision while everyone else in the room held their breath. Patients worshipped him, colleagues respected him, and administrators bent over backward to keep him happy. Yet the applause never seemed to be enough. His life had become predictable, and predictability gnawed at him like termites in a beam. When the parties ended and the hospital corridors emptied, Michael felt the weight of boredom pressing on his chest. The late-night glass of whiskey wasn't about taste, but distraction. The jogging sessions along the river weren't about health, but escape. His wife's smile, once exciting, had grown routine. What had once been his kingdom now felt like a cage built of wealth, success, and expectations. The truth was simple. Michael Hartley wanted more. More excitement, more danger, more validation that he was alive and untouchable. He had convinced himself that the rules didn't apply to him. That dangerous belief, quietly feeding on his ego, was the seed that would eventually crack his perfect life wide open. It was the winter of 2018 when a wealthy Emirati businessman checked into the private wing of St. Andrew's Hospital in Perth. The man's fortune was whispered about by staff in break rooms. Oil money, real estate, private jets. But what really caught everyone's attention wasn't the patient himself. It was his daughter, Layla, who arrived from Dubai to oversee his recovery. She carried herself like royalty, with diamond-studded sunglasses, silk scarves that seemed to float when she walked, and the kind of poise that made everyone else in the lobby shrink in comparison. Nurses pretended not to stare, orderlies fumbled with clipboards, and even the senior consultants found excuses to pass through her father's room just to get a glimpse. Layla wasn't just beau, but beneath all the expensive polish, Michael was restless. He thrived on control, and control came easily in the operating theater. When a heart was failing, he stepped in like a god, fixing the muscle with calm precision while everyone else in the room held their breath. Patients worshipped him, colleagues respected him, and administrators bent over backward to keep him happy. Yet the applause never seemed to be enough. His life had become predictable, and predictability gnawed at him like termites in a beam. When the parties ended and the hospital corridors emptied, Michael felt the weight of boredom pressing on his chest. The late-night glass of whiskey wasn't about taste, but distraction. The jogging sessions along the river weren't about health, but escape. His wife's smile, once exciting, had grown routine. What had once been his kingdom now felt like a cage built of wealth, success, and expectations. The truth was simple. Michael Hartley wanted more. More excitement, more danger, more validation that he was alive and untouchable. He had convinced himself that the rules didn't apply to him. That dangerous belief, quietly feeding on his ego, was the seed that would eventually crack his perfect life wide open. The affair ignited like gasoline on dry wood, burning hotter and faster than either of them expected. Within weeks, Michael was sneaking out under the guise of overnight shifts and medical conferences, slipping into hotel suites where Layla waited with champagne and that sly smile that made him feel like the center of the universe. Their secret life was a cocktail of lust, adrenaline, and recklessness. Beach drives under the cover of night, room service dinners that ended with clothes scattered on the floor, whispered plans about exotic places where no one knew their names. For Michael, It wasn't just about the physical escape. It was the intoxication of stepping outside the carefully curated image he had built for decades. With Layla, he was free, reckless, and dangerously alive. But freedom came at a price. Layla didn't want to be a side story. She wasn't content with stolen weekends and late-night phone calls cut short by his wife walking into the room. She wanted permanence, commitment, and the public acknowledgement of what they had. At first, her demands were playful, teasing him about running away together to Dubai. Soon, the teasing sharpened into ultimatums. She told him she was tired of being hidden, tired of being second best, and tired of waiting for him to choose. Michael, caught between desire and duty, started to feel the walls closing in. Layla had proof of everything: texts, emails, bank transfers for her flights, and lavish gifts. She hinted she might use them if he didn't act. The thrill that once lit him up now curdled into dread. He pictured his wife finding out, his kids turning on him, his reputation shattered in an instant. What had begun as an escape from boredom was turning into a noose around his neck. And in Michael's twisted logic, if he couldn't regain control by keeping both lives, he'd eventually find a darker way to take control of everything. By the end of 2019, the tension between Michael and Layla was a ticking bomb. Every message she sent felt like a blade pressed against his throat. Reminders of what she knew, threats wrapped in soft words, the promise that his family and colleagues would soon discover his double life. She demanded a meeting away from prying eyes, somewhere she could finally get the answers she wanted. Layla booked a secluded villa along the western Australian coast, a rental with floor-to-ceiling windows and a panoramic view of the ocean. On the surface, it looked like a lover's hideaway. In reality, it was the stage for something far darker. Michael drove there under the cover of night, heart pounding, but expression calm. To him, this was no longer about romance. It was about survival. In the trunk of his car, wrapped in an old gym bag, sat a knife he'd pulled from his own kitchen. He told himself it was just for protection, a safety net in case Layla tried to push him too far. But deep down, he knew why it was really there. When investigators later pieced together the scene, the brutality spoke louder than words ever could. Layla had been stabbed again and again, a frenzy of rage that left the walls splattered and the tiled floors slick with blood. There were no signs of struggle beyond the desperate claw marks she left as she collapsed. Whatever final words passed between them were swallowed by the surf outside and the silence of that isolated villa. Michael didn't stay long. He washed his hands in the sink, left her crumpled body cooling on the floor, and walked out into the night as though nothing had happened. His car disappeared down the coastal highway, taillights fading, carrying him back toward the carefully constructed life he was so desperate to protect. What he didn't realize was that he had left behind more evidence than any cover story could erase. Michael thought he could outsmart everyone. After leaving the villa, he drove home in silence, replaying the scene in his mind, but convincing himself he could bury it just like he had buried every mistake before. The first step was cleaning. He scrubbed his car with bleach until the smell stung his nose, dumped the rags in a roadside bin miles from home, and torched his blood-stained clothes in the fire pit behind his house. He even scrolled through his phone deleting messages, photos, and emails tied to Layla, thinking he was erasing her from existence. In his head, it was all damage control, a careful procedure just like surgery. But Michael underestimated just how much the world had already seen. The villa's security cameras captured him arriving with Layla and leaving alone, carrying a duffel bag that sagged under the weight of something heavy. Neighbors remembered seeing him pacing in his backyard late that night, feeding clothes into the flames. Forensic teams later dug through the ashes and found scraps of fabric and a melted zipper that matched the designer jacket Layla had gifted him. The rental car Layla used to drive to the villa became another nail in his coffin. Investigators tracked it with ease, logging her final trip and matching tire marks to the villa's driveway. Inside the car, a single strand of Michael's hair clung to the passenger seat, stubborn and incriminating. And in the garage of his pristine suburban home, hidden behind toolboxes, sat the kitchen knife still smeared with microscopic traces of Layla's blood. Michael returned to work the next morning, slipping on his white coat and flipping through patient charts as though nothing had happened. But whispers began to ripple through the hospital. Layla's sudden disappearance wasn't just gossip anymore. It was a full-blown investigation, and Michael had already left a trail impossible to cover. When the police finally moved in, Michael was pulled from his spotless suburban home like any other criminal. The arrest shocked Perth, but the real explosion came once the trial began. Overnight, he went from respected cardiologist to headline monster. News anchors labeled him the Doctor of Death, plastering his face across every screen. Tabloids dug into his past, printing photos of him and Layla leaving hotels, tracing credit card receipts for expensive gifts, and publishing leaked emails that revealed just how deep the affair had gone. The courtroom was a theater of its own. On one side sat Michael, pale and stiff in a suit that suddenly looked too big for him. On the other sat Layla's family, flown in from Dubai, their presence commanding respect and stirring a storm of international outrage. Cameras crowded the entrance every morning, reporters screaming questions as though the trial was a sporting event. The prosecution held nothing back. They laid out the timeline with clinical precision. The bank transfers to Layla, the threatening emails she had saved, the CCTV footage showing Michael entering the villa with her, and the knife recovered from his garage, tested and matched to her blood. They showed photos of the crime scene that made jurors visibly wince. Piece by piece, they painted a picture of a man who thought he was untouchable until he snapped. Michael's defense team tried to spin a story of self-defense. They suggested Layla had attacked him, that she was manipulative and unstable, and that he acted only in fear. But the evidence was a tidal wave, and the jury wasn't buying it. Every shred of forensic proof drowned out the excuses. By the time closing arguments wrapped, it was clear that Michael wasn't going home. His carefully built empire was already in ruins, and all that remained was the final blow of the verdict. The verdict hit like a hammer. Michael Hartley, once the golden boy of Perth's medical scene, was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 23 years before parole. The judge called his crime cold-blooded and calculated, words that echoed across every news outlet. Cameras caught his expressionless face as he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his polished reputation stripped away in a single moment. For the first time, the man who had controlled every detail of his life had no control at all. The fallout was brutal. Claire, his wife, wasted no time filing for divorce. She sold the waterfront home, removed his name from joint accounts, and cut ties so cleanly it was as if he had never existed. His children, humiliated and scarred by the public spectacle, changed their last name to distance themselves from the scandal. The hospital revoked his medical license, erasing decades of accolades and publications with a single ruling. Colleagues who once admired him now refused to even say his name. On the other side of the world, Layla's body was flown back to Dubai. Her funeral was heavily guarded, journalists kept far away, the family determined to bury the scandal alongside her. To them, the shame of her affair was almost as devastating as her death. Behind the walls of their estate, grief mixed with fury, and the story of the Australian doctor who had destroyed their daughter became whispered like a curse. Inside prison, Michael quickly learned that his former status meant nothing. Inmates mocked him, guards ignored his arrogance, and his life of control shrank to a concrete cell and a rigid routine he couldn't manipulate. The man who once played God in the operating room was now just another number in the system. His downfall became a cautionary tale. The trusted healer who let desire spiral into destruction, proving that even the most powerful masks can hide the darkest demons until the truth rips them off for good.